Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and this week doing another serial killer sample. I feel like we just did one a few weeks ago, but who cares? It's my show. I can do whatever I want, right? That's right. I think starting off year number 4 with obviously some more serial killers. Look, I've got a ton of them. I have 200 stories at the very least, probably a few more, because I have 2 versions of my 100 stories series dedicated to serial killers. So there's 200 right there. There's probably a few more sprinkled in throughout the other 100 stories that didn't get into that specific kind of anthology. So I got a lot to go through. And, you know, there's only so many weeks in every September, so we're going to just spread them out throughout the year. And this is number 5 of the Serial Killer Sampler series. And we're looking at 3. As always, we're looking at the stories of Gary Ridgway, Donald Henry Gaskins, and Jerry Brudos. All right, we're going to start with the story of Donald Henry Gaskins because it happened kind of the earliest in the sequence. If you haven't noticed, like anytime I have like a bunch of different stories, I tend to try to go a little bit chronologically, at least from like when the first like major event in the story's timeline happened. You probably didn't notice, and that's fine, but that's how I like to do things. And so we're starting with Donald Henry Gaskins, who was the last of just a gaggle of illegitimate children born to a woman named Eulia Parrott somewhere in Florence County, South Carolina on March 13th, 1933. He was quickly given the name Pee-wee because he was extra small, probably because Eulia drank and smoked throughout the entire pregnancy, which I don't know, maybe not drank, because it's 1933, that might be prohibition. It's also South Carolina. They probably just making their own, you know, bathtub moonshine or whatever. So she probably did. Who cares? It's South Carolina. They all suck. Eulia also didn't really take care of Donald, probably because she had a ton of other children to look after. And as an infant, Donald accidentally drank an entire bottle of kerosene. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how an infant, gets a hold of an entire bottle of kerosene. I don't know how big this bottle was. Maybe it was a small bottle. I don't know. But how does an infant also just not instinctively know to stop doing it? Kerosene can't taste good. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't have a taste. I've never drank kerosene before. It smells. It's got a smell, I think. I don't even know. Actually, it's been a while since I've used kerosene. Anyway, he drank a whole bottle of it as a baby, and you shouldn't do that. That's going to cause some problems later on. And this is also kind of sad. Eulia actually cared so little about Donald that he actually didn't even know what his name was until a future court date as a teenager after he was arrested for several robberies, assaults, and a gang rape. That's insane to me. Like, imagine him just sitting in a courtroom and the judge is just like, Donald Henry Gaskins. And he's just like sitting there, just waiting for someone to call him Pee-wee. And the judge is just like, Donald Henry Gaskins. And then like, as public defender, someone's like, dude, hey, he's calling. He's like, what? Oh, yeah, that's me. That's. I don't know who that is. My name is Pee-wee. And then, I don't know. It's weird. It's like it's not cool to celebrate this man anymore. But like, I was a big fan of Bill Cosby growing up, and he had one of those bits where he joked that like growing up he thought his name was Jesus Christ because that was the only thing his parents said anytime he ever did anything. But this is literally that Bill Cosby bit in real life. This dude's probably, 16, 17, 18 years old, has no idea what his government name is because his mother never used it around him. Instead of jail time, though, after this, Donald was sent to a reform school where he was regularly raped by the other students because that's what happens if you haven't picked up on it yet in these reform schools. Donald did eventually escape that school and decided to turn his life around. Actually, he got married. He even decided to voluntarily return to that reform school to finish out his sentence. And after his release in 1951, Donald worked on a tobacco farm for a couple of years before landing back in jail after assaulting a teenage girl with a hammer. Because, why not? While in prison, Donald's butt became every inmate's favorite play toy. He was tiny. Like, he's not going to defend himself. He's a tiny little person. And I don't know, I guess tiny little boys look close enough to like girls. I don't know. But he eventually did decide to stand up for himself and actually ended up killing the most feared prisoner in the prison where he was at, a guy named Hazel Brazel. Hazel Brazel? I don't know. Hazel Brazel just sounds like a fun way to say it. He was given an additional 3-year sentence for that murder, but actually ended up escaping prison 2 years later by hiding in the back of a garbage truck, which that is actually a pretty common way people have broken out of prisons. I can easily recall 3 other stories where that actually happened. After working as a carny, because that's exactly the kind of job an escaped convict has to get after they escape prison, Donald was recaptured and then sent back. He was paroled then in 1961 and went back to stealing other things because, why actually pay for them? 2 years later, he was arrested for raping a 12-year-old girl, but then somehow escaped from jail again. He was recaptured in Georgia and given an 8-year prison sentence for that rape. And here's the thing. I guess, because South Carolina doesn't understand how the justice system works, Donald was paroled again in 1968. At this point, he already has an extensive list of assaults and rapes. He has killed another inmate, and South Carolina's just I think we just let him go. He ain't that bad. At least he ain't black. Right? In 1969, a year after being paroled, he tortured and murdered a hitchhiker and dumped her body in a swamp. And that murder made him feel so good about himself that he then just started driving all around the South, picking up hitchhikers and murdering them. Every 6 weeks, he ended up telling authorities that he felt the need to cure his, quote, bothersomeness, which meant that he needed to kill someone. He's feeling annoyed. He's got some feelings. He's got some zapples like Ed Kemper, if you remember that episode from way on back. And he's got to get it out. Usually normal people just jerk off for a little bit and that's what fixes that. But no, Donald, he's like, I got to kill some people. I did kerosene as a baby, got to kill some people. And so for the next several years, Donald tortured and mutilated his victims, taking very great pleasure in keeping them on the brink of death for as long as he could. He would stab, suffocate, and then cannibalize his victims. And what's crazy is he does this, for a couple of years. And then starting in November 1970, he starts committing what he then called his serious murders. The ones prior to that in, 68, 69, those were just fun, all willy-nilly. It started with actually his 15-year-old niece and her 17-year-old friend who he beat to death after he tried to rape them. And then after that, anytime anyone made fun of him or tried to blackmail him or ironically stole from him, they all got murdered, right? It was okay for Donald to go around and commit robberies, but if somebody dared to steal from him, dead immediately. He even actually became a hitman for others who wanted other people dead. For example, in February of 1975, Donald was hired by Suzanne Owners to kill her boyfriend. He actually successfully completed the job, but then in this weird kind of classic like action comedy sort of fashion, he actually ended up having to kill 4 other people who he thought witnessed the initial murder. And so, like, he's not good at his job. Like, he's effective, just not good at it. 9 months later, Donald was finally arrested after one of his associates confessed to witnessing Donald kill 2 other people. Even more, Donald had confided in this guy that he had murdered several other people who were currently listed as missing persons. And then a month later, after a lot of interrogation, staying in police custody, Donald willingly led police to a plot of land where he had buried 8 of his victims. He was eventually tried and convicted of those 8 murders and sentenced to life in prison. But then, he wasn't done. Like, he's still working. He's still grinding. I can appreciate that. On September 4th, 1982, Donald was hired to kill Rudolph Tyner, a death row inmate who had murdered 2 elderly people after botching an armed robbery of the store that they owned. Donald gladly accepted because apparently you can just hire hits in prison. I don't know what you're offering. And also, like, he's on death row. Like, just, it's fine. It's going to happen anyway. Why? What's the point? But Donald, he was going for it. He started by trying to poison Tyner's food and drinks, but that never really seemed to work. And so instead of shanking him or just like choking him out, Donald then somehow rigged a portable radio with C4 explosives, which, how do you even get those inside of a prison? And told Tyner that it would allow him to communicate in between cells. And so at a specified time, Donald then told Tyner to hold the radio to his ear, at which point Donald flipped a switch and blew Tyner's head off. So, like, for a guy who is very mentally unstable, apparently he's really smart to figure out how to rig this setup and then convince this other guy that it's like this cool 2-way radio. We can communicate back and forth. And then he's like, well, at 9 o'clock, you just put that right up to your ear and I'll send you a message. And then he does it and he flips the switch and this guy's face gets blown off. Donald was convicted of that murder, obviously. And then they gave him the death sentence for that. Probably well-deserved. He then confessed to actually committing somewhere between 100 and 110 murders throughout his life, but South Carolina authorities were never really able to verify those claims. And then he was ultimately fried in the electric chair on September 6th, 1991. All right. Our next story here is of Jerry Brudos, who was born on January 31st, 1939 in Webster, South Dakota, to a mother who really wanted a daughter instead. And there's a very clear pattern in these 3 stories, because we'll see it with Gary Ridgway too a little bit. Moms, what are you doing? You're destroying your children's identity here with a lack of love or acceptance or something. I don't know. The family eventually settled in Salem, Oregon, where Jerry's mother constantly subjected him to emotional and physical abuse simply because he wasn't born a girl, which, I don't know. I don't know what kind of emotional abuse you can put on someone like that. I don't know. Anyway, starting at age 5, however, and probably I can probably see how this started. Jerry actually developed a fetish for women's clothes after finding a pair of stilettos at a junkyard, which likely would have made his mother happy if she knew about it, but probably because she would dress him in girls' clothes and like almost probably force him to act like a girl. And so somehow in his brain, probably brain damage from getting beaten, he finds this pair of stilettos and he now develops this foot fetish and fetish for like dressing as a woman in women's clothes. And like, here's the thing. I didn't know you could develop a fetish at age 5. That's insane to me. 'Cause like when I was 5, I don't know, man, I was just watching Rugrats and other stuff on like Nick Jr. And like, none of it was sexual. I was just like, at the Gullah Gullah Island and then there's face on the TV. And then we're watching Rocket Power and regrets. And I'm having a good time. And then I'd turn it over to Sports Center also, because that was fun. I was a weird kid. As a teenager, Jerry stalked women and then would knock them unconscious before running off with their shoes. He wouldn't rape them. He would see a pair of shoes that he really liked, and he would then just bonk them over the head and steal them, and then that's it. He was actually arrested at age 17 after threatening to stab a woman and spent 9 months in a psychiatric ward at Oregon State Hospital. Psychiatrist diagnosed him with schizophrenia and uncovered that all of his fetishes and sexual fantasies revolved around his own hatred for his mother. And like, that's the least surprising thing in this entire story. He eventually graduated high school and got a job as an electric technician. He even married a girl named Darcy, and they had 2 children, but like, that doesn't cure you from like your weird fetishes and your internal feelings towards your own mother. As soon as the 2 moved in together, Jerry asked Darcy to clean the house naked while he took pictures of her, which, I mean, look, if you can find a girl that's into that, nothing wrong with it. But if she's immediately creeped out by it, you can't do it. You just can't do it. And Darcy, not into it. He also started claiming that he would get severe migraines that could only be relieved by going out at night and stealing women's shoes and underwear. And that's not how migraines work. Like, I've never had a migraine, but I know people who do. And in order to get their migraines to go away, I've heard that they've got to be in a dark room and they've got to just sleep it off. Maybe they take like some, is it Excedrin for migraines? Something, right? And they just like, they have to just isolate, get in a nice quiet room. No one has ever said that they need to cure their migraines by going out and stealing underwear, because that's silly. In January of 1968, Linda Slauson, a 19-year-old encyclopedia saleswoman, because that was a job that you used to actually be able to do, knocked on Jerry's door and tried to sell the latest round of encyclopedias to him. Instead, Jerry invited her in, took her down to his basement, bonked her over the head with a wooden plank, and then strangled her to death. And then from there, he dressed her in various shoes and undergarments that he had stolen from other women and arranged her body in several sexual poses. And then he sawed off her foot and put it in the freezer. Just 1 foot, and then put it in the freezer. After dumping the rest of her body in the nearby Willamette River, he returned home and used this girl's severed foot to model all of the shoes that he had stolen. And like, I don't know, all of those shoes could not have been the right size. I don't know why that's where my mind goes, but it's just like, he had to have been kind of disappointed sometimes, because he had like a favorite shoe. And you also know that Linda's foot probably too big for that one shoe, and it probably just ate at him and made his dumb little migraine worse. And so he had to go out and find another foot, right? And that's probably what he did, because in May of 1968, he abducted 18-year-old Karen Sprinker from a department store parking lot. He was actually wearing women's clothes at the time of the kidnapping, and he took Karen back to his garage and dressed her up in various other outfits before raping and strangling her as well. He then had sex with her body after she was dead and cut off her breasts to make plastic molds. Can't imagine why, right? Like, this dude's going like Ed Gein level of horrifically creepy, right? Because if you remember from Ed Gein, from way back, like, Ed Gein was so obsessed with his mother, but in a more loving way. I'll give him credit for it. He would go up and dig up bodies from local cemeteries. And like, by the time he got captured, he was starting to make a skin suit so that he could literally be his own mother. All right. Jerry, on the other hand, he's just trying to be a woman because his mother wanted him, and like, he hated his mother, but he just wants to make his mama proud or something. Who knows? Ugh, gross. However, so look, I mean, eventually he got everything he could out of Karen's body, and he tied it to a 6-cylinder car engine and threw it in the Willamette River. On November 26, 1968, Jerry came across 23-year-old Jan Susan Whitney after her car had broken down on Interstate 5. After luring her into his car with the promise of letting her call a tow truck once they arrived back at his house, Jerry strangled her with a leather strap and again had sex with her dead body. He then made a resin mold of her breast to use as a paperweight. Odd. He then tied the body to a piece of railroad iron and threw it again in the Willamette River. He also, at this time, tossed Linda Slauson's foot, which by now had rotted. And yeah, after like 10 months, I would imagine so. After failing to abduct 2 more women, Jerry then abducted 22-year-old Linda Saley from a mall parking lot on April 23rd, 1969. As with the other women, he strangled her to death, raped her dead body in the garage. However, this time, rather than cutting off her breast because he said that they were too pink. I don't know what that means. I don't know. Like, ladies, are your boobs different colors than the rest of your skin? I don't know. Maybe he's talking about nips. I don't know. That's weird though. That's just a weird hang up for somebody to do after they've already murdered and raped the corpse. It's just like, it's so stupid to me. I don't understand it. Where it's just like, he's just gotten done with killing this poor woman. He's had sex with her body so many times. And then he goes to like cut off her breast and he's just like, nah, they're too pink. I don't like them. And he's just, I don't know. That one really boggles my mind. Here's the thing though. He, instead of like initially going and dumping her, he actually tried to reanimate her body. He's just full Dr. Frankenstein at this point. He tries to pump electrical currents through her body, which obviously didn't work. So he couldn't bring her back to life. And so with nothing else to do, he tied her to a transmission and threw it into the Willamette River. Where is he getting all these spare car parts? Also, that's like some weird detail too. He's just got all of these random, extremely heavy car parts that he's just tying to these women's bodies and sending them to the bottom of this river. A month later, though, a fisherman found Saley and Sprinker's bodies in the Long Tom River and told police, who then started asking students at a nearby university campus if they knew of any suspicious men in the area. One student quickly spoke up and led them to Jerry, because Jerry had been harassing her for a date for several months, and she was rightly very creeped out and always refused. When police searched Jerry's garage, they found copper wire that was cut by the same tool that cut the cords that Jerry used to tie up the bodies, which was somehow enough for them to make an arrest. I don't know what kind of circumstantial evidence they did, but it worked. Jerry pled guilty to 3 murder charges and was given 3 consecutive life sentences. As soon as he got to prison, he started writing letters to fashion companies asking them to send him shoe catalogs, which he began stashing in his cell. Dude's just weird, man. He actually appealed his sentence on numerous occasions, but was finally told in 1995 that he would never be granted parole. Good call. He then died on March 28th, 2006 from liver cancer. Our third and final story here is of Gary Ridgway, who was born on February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City. He was a constant bedwetter, which actually forced his mother, Mary, to aggressively and thoroughly wash his genitals every single time he wet the bed. And like, that's unnecessary, right? Like, you tell the kid, like, oh no, kid wet his bed. Okay, wash yourself off. Just just grab a quick shower, change your clothes, go back to bed. But no, Mary Ridgway, she was like, I freaked out about this. I don't know if she just thought that like getting pee on any part of your body was just going to make it start rotting or what, but she would just get all up in there, all up in her son's crevices and just really, really washing it. And that's just a weird visual. Just, because you get to a certain, like if he's like 2 or 3, it's probably fine. But like once you get to like 7, 8, 10, 12, like what was happening with Gary, it's weird. It's not acceptable. You're starting to really screw with people's minds. And look, as Gary grew into a teenager, he started fighting these conflicting feelings of both hate and sexual attraction to his mother, partly because like her constantly washing his downstairs was humiliating, but then also like as a teenager, any kind of motion and stimulation down there is going to get you turned on, even if it's your mother. And like, you don't want that to happen, but then when it does happen, not saying this has happened to me, but I know how the process works. I feel like I needed to clarify that. But like, yeah, you're going to be very conflicted and confused because you're mad that your mom is doing this because she doesn't have to. But then also you're like, oh yeah, get in there because it feels good. And so Gary just in a real weird place in life with all of this. And so in 1960, the Ridgway family moved to a suburb of Seattle. Although Gary was dyslexic and actually attempted to murder a 6-year-old, he ended up having like a pretty decent childhood. Aside from all the times his mom was giving him like quasi hand jobs. And he eventually graduated high school, married his high school girlfriend, and then he joined the Navy where he was sent off to Vietnam. And while he was there, he attracted gonorrhea after sampling several Vietnamese and Filipino prostitutes, but that did not stop him from sinking himself into every bit of poontang that he could find while out there. Oh, we got a little gonorrhea? Who cares, man? Just keep sinking it in there. Who cares if you're, continuing to ruin these women's lives, and who cares if you got some ooze coming out your wiener and it burns every time you pee. It is what it is, man. At least your mom's not down there scrubbing it. And I think that's probably why he kept doing it. He's probably just in the middle of a very painful sexual encounter with a Vietnamese lady. And all he can think about is just like, yeah, at least mom ain't here. At least mom can't make the pain go away. Gross. Where are we at? Meanwhile, and here's the thing, like, don't feel bad about Gary's wife here in this situation, because while Gary's off on deployment, his wife was cheating on him anyway. So it worked out. Or I guess like technically it didn't, like the two got divorced less than a year later. And as if the rampant like prostitute use wasn't a sign, Gary had developed this really insatiable sexual appetite. And like, he tried to be a normal guy. Like, he got married to a new woman named Marsha Winslow in 1973. Like, the couple joined a local church, which is the exact place you go to repress all of your sexual urges. And like, he tried to like reframe his urges, and he tried to like transfer his lust for women into like a lust for Jesus. And like, he cried at almost every church service. He constantly carried a Bible with him. And I know people like this, right? Like, I've seen so many people, like, maybe they're drug addicts, or maybe they were like, like Gary was, just like constantly having sex with all these people. And then they go into church and they like transfer that same addictive personality into an addiction for Jesus. And it's just like, to me, it doesn't feel like it's coming from a genuine place. Like, that's just where they're focusing their energy. Like, nothing has actually happened. Like, they're still, massaging that addiction and that urge that they have. It's just through a channel that doesn't hurt anybody else. And so I'm very wary of people like that. I sound like a dick for saying it, but I don't care. Despite Gary doing all of this though, like, it wasn't enough. By the late 1970s, the couple's church going had become more and more infrequent. Gary was arriving home from work later and later every day. He was often dirty and wet when he did so, which, considering his job was painting trucks at the Kenworth truck factory, didn't make a lot of sense. By 1980, Gary and Marcia had divorced, mainly because Gary had started this thing where he would just sneak up behind Marcia and start choking her out. And then when she pushed him off, Gary would be like, "What? It's not me. It's somebody else in the house. I swear, baby, I wasn't doing that. It wasn't me. I got a chokehold on my love for Jesus. I wouldn't choke you. I'd choke Jesus with all the love that he has put in my heart. But I wouldn't choke you, Marcia. That's silly." And of course, Marcia doesn't buy this. But they ended up getting divorced. But Gary quickly got back on his feet, hit the dating scene, which usually, to his credit, ended up with, every date he went on would end up fornicating with someone in the woods. But the relationships never really lasted long, mainly because Gary would keep cheating on his new girlfriends with, other prostitutes in the Seattle area. And starting in 1982, rather than just ending the relationship and going back to their normal lives, Gary's lady friends began disappearing. On July 8th, 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield was reported missing, and her body was found a week later on the banks of the Green River under a bridge in the town of Kent, Washington. By August 15th, after King County Police had discovered 5 more bodies, all of which who were prostitutes that had been strangled, with some of them having rocks stuffed into their front bottom area, authorities ended up launching the biggest task force in Washington's history since Ted Bundy. Somehow, though, despite all of these police officers and investigators looking for this murderer, it didn't matter, because over the next 4 months, 9 more prostitutes between the ages of 15 and 23 were murdered and then just thrown on the banks of the Green River. The next year, 23 more women were killed. And actually, what's crazy about this is Ridgway was questioned by police in connection to one of the women who had been murdered, Marie Malvar, but because there wasn't enough physical evidence to directly link her murder to Gary, they set him free. In 1983 and then again in 1984, Gary was interviewed by the Green River Task Force, who was ultimately charged with finding out that Gary was the killer. They bring him in. He's been questioned 3 times by this task force. Not because he had been spotted with one, but he had been spotted with several of the prostitutes who had gone missing. 2 other prostitutes in the area who weren't dead yet even told investigators that Gary was absolutely the one who was killing all of them. But that still wasn't enough evidence, especially because Gary voluntarily took and passed a lie detector test, proving that those things are completely worthless and that you could get around them. In November, here's what's crazy. In November, the task force was so desperate that they called up Ted Bundy in prison in Florida, and asked him to share his expertise. Ted actually assisted in building a psychological profile of the killer. And in conjunction with that, police ramped up their patrols of Seattle's more well-known prostitution areas. Even though it didn't lead to his capture, it did actually slow Gary's murder rate down. He only killed 2 people in 1984, didn't kill anyone in 1985, and only killed 1 person in 1986. Part of that, though, was that he met a woman named Judith Mawson at a bar in Seattle, and then the 2 got married in 1988, I believe is what it was. But while they were dating, actually in 1987, police obtained a search warrant. They'd finally had enough people be like, "Dude, it's definitely Gary." And police are just like, "No, we questioned him. He did a lie detector. It's not him." And then everybody's like, "No, you're wrong. It's 1,000% Gary." So they ended up getting a search warrant and actually collected hair and saliva samples from Gary's home. However, even then, they've got DNA evidence, and it still wasn't enough to connect him to any of the murders. Over the next 4 years, Gary only killed 2 people, which still bad, but somehow like not as bad as it could have been. Like I said, like Gary and Judith got married, which actually seemingly turned Gary into a different person. Like he kind of reset himself again. He was super friendly to all of his neighbors. He kept his home and his yard in like super pristine condition. He even like organized neighborhood garage sales twice a month. Like he's the nicest, coolest neighbor anyone's ever had. And for the next 13 years, it was like nothing was ever out of the ordinary. Like the 90s, Gary is just the model citizen and he's living life. He's super nice. Everyone loves him. And then in 2001, the DNA samples that had been collected back in 1987 were given this fancy new analyzation process that finally connected him to all of those Green River murders. And on November 30th, police arrived at the Kenworth truck factory where Gary had been painting trucks all of these years and arrested him on 4 murders where DNA evidence had been linked with semen found inside the victims that they later found out that he had deposited inside of them after he had murdered them. Because sure, why not be worse? Another 3 victims were added to the list after a forensic scientist identified microscopic spray paint particles that Kenworth used during the time of his murders. Like that right there, that fact right there is what should convince everyone that like you're never going to get away with another murder. If a forensic scientist can identify microscopic particles and connect it to like where you work or a piece of clothing that you own, like there's no way anyone should ever get away with any murder ever. 2 years later, 2003, Gary entered a plea bargain and confessed to 48 murders that would in turn spare him from the death penalty as long as he helped locate the remains of several more victims. He was given 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole. He eventually confessed to murdering and having sex with a total of 71 victims, which, you know, if that's true, that would make him one of, if not the most prolific serial killers in all of history. As of this recording, I believe that he is still, the last update I think was 2015. Like he is still in Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. And that is the end of our stories. All right, there you go. Serial killer sampler number 5 in the books. Already going extra long today, so let's jump in to see what we learned.
What did we learn?
Number 1, ladies, if you are a mom and you're listening to this, like, if you had a boy and you really wanted a girl, cut your losses. Maybe try again for a girl. I don't know. But if you have a boy, love them. All right. That's the first thing. Number 2, if they wet the bed, do not, like, maybe early on, wipe them down. That's fine. But like when they get of age to kind of be able to do it themselves, hands off. All right. You're going to cause some mental distress because on one hand, they're going to feel weird that their mom is just aggressively all up around their balls and like, you know, probably quasi jerking them off with soap. All right. Don't do that because it's also going to feel good and they're not going to want it. They're not going to know how to feel about that. All right. And then number 3, please call them by their name. All right. Maybe they have a nickname. Sure. That's fine. But also make sure that they know what their government name is. Yeah. Just a lot of poor parenting in this episode. next week on Our Weird World, we're moving from terrible mothers to some terrible teenagers. Teenagers suck, all kinds of hormones and emotions that they don't understand, and they don't care to try to understand it. They just feel it, and I get it because I was there. But we're going to look at 4 stories from some exceptionally terrible teenagers. We're looking at the stories of Charlie Brandt, Daniel LaPlante, Brenda Spencer, and Josh Phillips. So that's it for this week. Thank you for continuing to listen. Please keep telling all of your friends and keep it weird. Welcome to the jungle. We've got fun and games. We got everything you want, honey. We know the names. We are the people that can find whatever you may need. If you got the money, honey, we got your disease. In the jungle, welcome to the jungle. Watch it bring you to your knees. Knees. Mwah. I want to watch you bleed. Welcome to the jungle. We take it day by day. If you want it, you're gonna bleed, but it's the price to pay. And you're a very sexy girl who's very hard to please. You can taste the bright lights, but you won't get there for free. In the jungle, welcome to the jungle. Feel my serpentine. Probably means dick. Ooh, ah, I want to hear you scream. Welcome to the jungle. It gets worse here every day. You learn to live like an animal in the jungle where we play. If you got a hunger for what you see, you'll take it eventually. You can have anything you want, but you better not take it from me. In the jungle, welcome to the jungle. Watch it bring you to your knees. Knees.